The law of the frontier is simple. You mind your own business, or the wilderness will mind it for you. It's a harsh rule, etched into the baked red dirt and the bones of those who forgot it. For a woman living alone at the edge of the world, a woman whose only neighbors were ghosts in the howling wind, that law was supposed to be everything. But what happens when that law gets broken? What happens when a scream rips through the quiet afternoon? A sound that doesn't belong? The sound of a child being torn apart by wolves? For Sarah McGregor, a widow haunted by a silence deeper than the prairie sky, that sound was a reckoning. She finds the boy, a native child, the son of the very people who shattered her world. And in that moment, she has a choice. Obey the law of the frontier and turn her back, or obey the law of her heart and raise her gun. She chose her heart, and that night, as a skull-white moon hangs over her isolated cabin, she hears them coming, the silent, painted warriors of his tribe. They surround her home, not with arrows drawn, but with gifts that will unravel a story of lies, desperation, and a secret that will rewrite the very meaning of justice in the untamed West. The silence of the Arizona territory wasn't empty. It was full of things, full of the high, lonely cry of a hawk circling overhead, full of the dry rustle of unseen things moving through the grama grass, full of the memories that screamed louder than any living voice. For Sarah McGregor, that silence was a shroud she'd wrapped around herself for 3 years. It was a cold comfort, but it was a comfort nonetheless. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of a timber cabin and a patch of stubborn dirt that fought her for every turnip and bean. At 28, she felt 100. She'd come here with a husband, Corporal John McGregor, a man with a laugh as wide as the plains and a promise of a life carved from the wilderness. He delivered the home, but the wilderness had claimed him. A Chiricahua Apache ambush had left her a widow at 25, a solitary monument to a broken promise. The folks in San Carlos spat about, the devils of the desert, were the architects of her solitude. 3 years. That's how long it had been. 3 years of hardening. The soft woman who'd arrived with dreams of adventure was gone, weathered away like the paint on the cabin shutters. In her place was a woman who knew the heft of a Winchester rifle better than the hand of a friend. Her hands, once skilled with a needlepoint, were now calloused and capable, just as ready to skin a rabbit as they were to chamber a round. Her face was a roadmap of her grief, her blue eyes holding the same vast, empty sorrow as the sky above. She didn't go into town anymore. The pitying looks from the women and the gruff, clumsy condolences from the men were like salt in a wound that would never heal. They saw a tragedy. They didn't see the strength she'd forged in the fire of her loneliness. Her only real visitor was Jedediah Stone, an old fur trapper who passed through twice a year with gossip and potent coffee. He'd known John. Their visits were comfortable rituals of shared silence. This particular afternoon, the sun was a hammer. Sarah was checking her snares, kicking up puffs of red dust with every step. The heat made the distant mountains dance and blur. It was a day like any other, a slow rhythm of chores dictated by the sun. Until the sound came. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a coyote. It was the terrified, high-pitched wail of a child. Her head snapped up. Her hand, moving on pure instinct, went to the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at her hip. The sound was coming from a rocky outcrop a quarter-mile away, a jagged spine of granite that jutted from the plains like a broken bone. Her heart, a muscle she thought had gone numb, began to pound against her ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. Children were a ghost out here, a currency she hadn't dealt in since the loss of her own. A stillborn daughter, another secret buried in the lonely cabin. Caution warred with an instinct she hadn't felt in years. This was Apache land. A child alone could be a trap. John had told her stories of such tactics, a lure to draw soldiers into an ambush, but the cry that echoed again wasn't a trick. It was pure, undiluted terror. It was a sound that bypassed reason and struck a chord deep inside her, the phantom ache of a mother's empty arms. She drew her Colt, the familiar weight a cold comfort in her hand. She began to move, her steps light, her eyes scanning the rocks. The closer she got, another sound joined the child's cries, the low, guttural growls of a wolf pack. Her blood ran cold. The long, dry season had made the wolves bold. For a child, they were a death sentence. She crested a small rise and saw them. A boy, no older than 5 or 6, was backed into a crevice in the rocks. His face was a mask of tear-streaked dirt, his small brown body clad only in a breechcloth. He was Apache, the single feather tied in his long black hair, the intricate beadwork on his moccasins. They were unmistakable. He clutched a small, crude wooden knife, a pathetic defense against the 4 lean, gray wolves that circled him. Their lips were curled back, revealing yellowed fangs. Their hungry eyes were locked on their cornered prey. For a single agonizing heartbeat, Sarah froze. This was the son of her enemy, the child of the people who had shattered her world, who had taken her John. The bitter irony was like ash in her mouth. Every instinct of self-preservation, every law of the frontier, screamed at her to turn back, to leave the boy to his fate, to let the wilderness claim one of its own. It was the only logical thing to do. But then, the boy's eyes met hers, and in their dark, terrified depths, she didn't see an Apache. She didn't see an enemy. She saw a child, small, helpless, and about to be torn apart. In his face, she saw the ghost of her own lost daughter, the face of all the what-ifs and might-have-beens that haunted her waking hours. The law of the frontier be damned. A guttural roar ripped from her own throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage she didn't know she possessed. "Get away from him!" The wolves, startled, turned their attention to this new threat. The alpha, a big male with a scarred muzzle and intelligent, malevolent eyes, took a step towards her, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Sarah didn't hesitate. She raised the Colt, the hammer already cocked, and fired. The shot cracked through the stillness of the afternoon, a violent punctuation to the silent drama. The bullet slammed into the alpha's shoulder. It yelped, stumbling back, its leg buckling. The other wolves, unnerved by the loud report in the injury to their leader, hesitated, their predatory focus shattered. Sarah fired again, this time into the dirt right in front of them, sending a shower of dust and rock fragments into their faces. That was enough. The alpha, whimpering, turned and limped away. The rest of the pack, their courage broken, followed, melting back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the boy's ragged, hitching sobs. Sarah stood for a long moment, the Colt still raised, her chest heaving, the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the hot air. Slowly she lowered the gun, her eyes fixed on the small figure huddled in the rocks. She holstered the Colt and approached him cautiously, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. "It's all right," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended, raspy from disuse. "They're gone. You're safe." The boy flinched as she drew closer, pressing himself deeper into the crevice. His dark eyes, wide and luminous with unshed tears, watched her with a mixture of terror and bewilderment. He was trembling, a small leaf shaken by a storm. "I'm not going to hurt you," Sarah said, keeping her voice low and steady. She knelt a few feet away, making herself smaller, less threatening. She could see now that he had a nasty gash on his leg, a bite from one of the wolves that had gotten too close. It was bleeding sluggishly, staining the rock beneath him. He said nothing. He just stared, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. His silence was a wall between them, a barrier as real as the jagged rocks that surrounded them. Sarah knew she couldn't leave him here. He was injured, alone, and miles from any possible settlement. The wolves could return, or worse, the heat or the infection from the wound would claim him. The decision was made before the thought had even fully formed. She was taking him back to her cabin. "Come on now," she said softly, extending a hand. "Let's get that leg looked at." The boy shrank back from her offered hand, his fear a palpable thing. Of course he was afraid. She was the monster from his people's stories, the white invader who had a fire stick that made a sound like thunder. Sarah sighed, a long, weary sound. This was not going to be easy. She looked at his terrified face, and then down at his wrist. There, tattooed in a faint bluish ink, was a small, strange symbol, a broken arrow inside a circle. It was delicate, precise work. It wasn't a warrior's marking. It was something else entirely. something she'd never seen before. What on earth did it mean? As she looked at the terrified child, a fierce, protective instinct she thought had died with her daughter surged within her. She would not, could not abandon him. She was no longer just a widow surviving on the edge of the world. She was a woman who had just stared down a wolf pack for a child who should have been her enemy. And in the vast, unforgiving silence of the prairie, that act had changed everything. Getting the boy back to the cabin was an ordeal of silent negotiation. He refused her hand, his body rigid with a fear that was almost painful to witness. In the end, Sarah simply stood, her posture deliberately non-threatening, and began to walk slowly back the way she had come. After a few paces, she glanced back. He was still huddled in the rocks, his dark eyes tracking her every move. She stopped and waited. The sun beat down. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Finally, with a visible effort that seemed to cost him all his courage, he pushed himself to his feet, hissing in pain as he put weight on his injured leg. He began to follow her, limping badly, keeping a careful distance of at least 20 feet between them. The journey was a slow, surreal procession across the sun-scorched plains. Sarah led the way, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. What had she done? Taking in an Apache child, a child of the Chiricahua, wasn't just foolish. It was suicidal. The army, stationed not 30 miles away, operated on a simple, brutal calculus when it came to the Apache. They were a threat to be neutralized, their children included. If they found him here, they would likely kill him without a second thought, and her for harboring him, and his own people. If they found him here, what would they think? That she had stolen him? Would they come for him with rifles and war cries, the same way they had come for John's patrol? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. But then she would glance back at the small, limping figure trailing behind her, his face a stoic mask of pain, and the fear would recede, replaced by a stubborn, unyielding resolve. She had made a choice. She would see it through. Back inside the cool, dim interior of the cabin, the boy stood frozen by the door, his eyes wide as he took in the strange alien world of a white woman's home. The sturdy wooden table and chairs, the iron bedstead with its patchwork quilt, the cast iron stove, the shelves lined with tins and jars. It was a world away from the wick-ups and the open sky of his people. Sarah ignored his awe and his fear, moving with a practiced efficiency. She stoked the fire in the hearth to heat a kettle of water, her movements calm and deliberate. She tore a clean strip from an old linen sheet and retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf. It contained her meager medical supplies, a jar of foul-smelling herbal salve Jedediah had given her, a needle and thread, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. "Come here," she said gently, patting the seat of a wooden chair. "Let me see that leg." The boy remained rooted to the spot, his eyes darting from her to the Winchester leaning against the wall, then to the door, as if plotting an escape. Sarah sighed. "I'm not going to hurt you," she repeated, her voice laced with a weariness that went beyond the day's events. "That bite needs cleaning, or the fever will set in. You understand fever?" She mimed, shivering, and wiped a hand across her brow. Whether he understood her words or her pantomime, she couldn't be sure. But the mention of fever seemed to register. He had likely seen its effects before, the way it could turn a strong warrior into a delirious, dying man. Slowly, hesitantly, he limped towards the chair, and after a moment's pause sat on the very edge of it, his body tensed as if ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Up close, she could see him more clearly. He was thin, but not starved. His small frame was wiry and strong. His skin was the color of rich, polished copper, and his hair was a sheet of glossy black silk. But it was his eyes that held her. They were ancient eyes in a child's face, dark and deep and filled with a sorrow that seemed too vast for his small years. He had seen things, she realized, things no child should ever have to see. "My name is Sarah," she said softly as she knelt before him, dipping the linen strip into the warm water. "Sarah McGregor." He said nothing, his jaw set in a stubborn line. His silence was not just the result of fear, she began to suspect. It was a conscious act of defiance, a shield against her and her world. "I don't know your name," she continued, her voice a low murmur, as she began to gently clean the wound on his leg. "So, I'll have to call you something. I'll call you Noted. In the language of a tribe from a land I'd long since left, it meant wind. It seemed to fit the wild, untamable spirit she sensed in him. He flinched when the warm cloth touched his skin, but he did not pull away. He watched her, his dark eyes unblinking, as she carefully cleaned the jagged tears in his flesh. The bite was deep. It would need stitches. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, holding up the needle. She took a quick swig of the whiskey herself. The burn a welcome shock, then poured a little onto the wound. The boy let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of breath, his hands gripping the edge of the chair until his knuckles were white. But he did not cry out. Sarah's respect for him grew. He had more courage than many of the grown men she had known. She worked quickly, her stitches small and neat, a skill learned from mending clothes and horse blankets, now applied to human flesh. The boy sat unnaturally still, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. He seemed to have retreated into himself, to a place where her clumsy attempts at medicine could not touch him. When she was finished, she coated the wound in the thick, pungent salve and wrapped it tightly with the remaining linen. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "That should hold." She rose and moved to the stove, her own body aching with a weariness that was both physical and emotional. She ladled rabbit stew from the pot into a bowl and placed it on the table in front of him, along with a wooden spoon. He stared at the stew, then at her, his expression unreadable. He made no move to eat. "You need to eat," Sarah urged, "to get your strength back." Still, he refused. He had not uttered a single sound. His silence was an impenetrable fortress. Exhausted, Sarah gave up trying. She took a bowl for herself and sat at the other end of the table, eating in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of her spoon against the bowl and the crackle of the fire. As darkness fell, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin, a new tension crept into the room. She had a Chiricahua Apache child in her home, a child of the people who had killed her husband. The reality of her situation settled upon her with a crushing weight. She prepared her own bed, a simple cot in the corner, then laid a spare blanket on the floor near the hearth. "You can sleep here," she said, pointing to the blanket. The boy watched her, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. Sarah sighed and retreated to her cot, too tired to argue. She lay down, clothes and all, the Winchester propped within arm's reach. She did not expect to sleep, but exhaustion was a potent drug. She drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, her dreams a tangled mess of wolf fangs and her husband's smiling face. She was awoken sometime later by a sound. It was not the wind, nor an animal. It was a soft, whimpering cry, the sound of a child in the grip of a nightmare. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The boy was thrashing on the blanket, his small body contorted. He cried out again, a single guttural word in a language she did not understand. A name, perhaps. "Taza! Taza!" He was dreaming, his face slick with sweat. Forgetting her fear, forgetting he was the son of her enemy, Sarah swung her legs off the cot and crossed the room. She knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder, uncertain. What comfort could she, a white woman, offer to a child of the Apache? "It's all right," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "You're safe. It was just a dream." She laid a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. His skin was hot, too hot. The fever she had feared was setting in. She did what she would have done for her own child. She fetched a cloth and dipped it in cool water from the basin. She sat beside him, gently wiping his brow, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. She murmured soft, soothing words, not in any language, just sounds of comfort, the universal language of a mother. Slowly, under her gentle ministrations, the boy's thrashing subsided. His breathing deepened, and he slipped from the grip of the nightmare into a true, deep sleep. Sarah sat with him for a long time, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. The silence of the cabin returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a shared silence, filled with the presence of another human being. A small, fragile life that had, for now, been entrusted to her care. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Sarah looked at the sleeping boy. his face now peaceful, and felt a profound and unsettling shift within her. The hatred she had nurtured for 3 years had begun to erode, replaced by something she couldn't yet name. This silent Apache boy she had pulled from the jaws of wolves had also pulled her from the jaws of her own solitary grief, and she was terrified of what would happen next. The next 2 days passed in a haze of fever and watchful silence. The boy, Noden, as she still called him in her mind, drifted in and out of consciousness, his small body racked with shivers despite the oppressive heat of the day. Sarah was a constant, tireless presence at his side. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and changed the dressing on his leg, which was red and angry looking. He fought her at times, his delirium making him see her as a threat, but she was persistent, her gentle strength a surprising match for his fever-fueled struggles. During his lucid moments, he would simply watch her, his dark eyes filled with a weary confusion. He still refused to speak, his silence a stubborn, unbroken vow. Sarah found herself talking to him constantly, filling the quiet cabin with the sound of her voice. She told him about the green hills of her childhood home in Ohio, about her father, the doctor, and her mother who grew the most beautiful roses. She spoke of John, not of his death, but of his life, his booming laugh, the way he would hum off key while he repaired a fence. She talked about her stillborn daughter, a confession whispered into the still, hot air, a secret she had never spoken aloud to another living soul. She didn't know if he understood her words, but he seemed to listen, his gaze fixed on her face. It was as if he were absorbing her stories, her sorrows, her very essence. And in the telling, Sarah felt a lightening in her own soul, a release of pressure she hadn't even been aware of. The ghosts of her past were still there, but now they had a witness. On the third day, the fever broke. Sarah awoke to find Noden sitting up on his blanket, his eyes clear and focused. He was still weak, but the delirium was gone. He was watching her with an intensity that was unnerving. When their eyes met, he looked away, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Later that morning, he accepted a bowl of thin broth from her, his first real food in days. He ate slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving her face. The silence between them was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a wall of fear and defiance. It was something more complex, a space of cautious observation, of mutual assessment. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps now he would speak. But the day wore on, and he remained silent. The quiet truce was shattered in the late afternoon by the sound of approaching horses. It wasn't the rhythmic beat of a lone rider like Jedediah. It was the steady, purposeful beat of multiple hooves. The sound of cavalry. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. 4 riders were approaching, their blue uniforms a stark, unwelcome sight against the brown and green of the plains. They were from the fort, and they were heading directly for her cabin. "Get down!" she hissed at the boy, her voice sharp with urgency. "And don't make a sound." Noden, seeing the raw fear in her face, scrambled from his blanket and crawled under the low bedstead, pulling the patchwork quilt down to conceal himself. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic pounding of her heart. She smoothed her hair, straightened her apron, and schooled her features into a mask of placid neutrality. She opened the door just as the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. The man in the lead was Sergeant Miles Corrigan, a thick-set man with a florid face and small, suspicious eyes. He was a man who enjoyed the small measure of authority his uniform gave him, and he'd made his unwelcome advances on Sarah more than once in the past. She despised him. "Afternoon, Mrs. McGregor," Corrigan said, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in her slightly disheveled appearance. "A little far out for a social call, I know. Just on patrol." "Sergeant," Sarah acknowledged, her voice cool and even. "What can I do for you?" "We're looking for a stray," Corrigan said, dismounting. The other 3 men remained on their horses, their rifles held loosely in their laps, their eyes scanning the horizon. "An Apache whelp. Seems the son of the great Chief Cochise himself wandered off from the San Carlos reservation a few days back. Boy, about 6 years old. You ain't seen anything unusual, have you?" Sarah's blood ran cold. the son of Cochise. It couldn't be. The chief who had led the band that killed John, the stakes, already impossibly high, had just skyrocketed into a realm she couldn't comprehend. "The only thing I ever see out here is dust and rabbits, Sergeant," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within her. "You know that." Corrigan's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "Funny thing is," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "we tracked him to this area. Tracks disappeared about a quarter-mile from here, near that rocky outcrop." He gestured with his head to the very place where she had found the boy. "Almost as if someone picked him up." Sarah held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the boy's presence under the bed, a silent, terrified weight. "If a child was out here alone, Sergeant, I imagine the wolves would have found him long before I did." "Maybe," Corrigan said, not convinced. His gaze drifted past her into the dim interior of the cabin. "You all alone out here, Sarah. It ain't safe. A woman on her own." He used her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "I could be persuaded to check the interior, make sure everything's secure." The threat was unmistakable. He was using his authority to intimidate her, to force his way into her home. The old Sarah might have been cowed, but the woman who had faced down a wolf pack was not so easily intimidated. "I am perfectly capable of securing my own home, Sergeant," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "My husband taught me how to use a rifle, and I'm a very good shot. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have chores to do." She made to close the door, but Corrigan put a hand out to stop it, his face flushing with anger at her rejection. "You'd be wise to remember who your friends are, Sarah," he snarled. "There's a bounty on that Apache boy. $50. A lot of money for a lonely widow." The words hung in the air, a vile insinuation. He thought she was hiding the boy for money. The idea was so grotesque that a raw, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. "Get off my land, Sergeant," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Corrigan stared at her for a long moment, his little eyes filled with malice. But there was something in her eyes, a glint of hard, unyielding steel, that made him hesitate. He was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward at heart. With a final contemptuous sneer, he turned and swung himself back onto his horse. "Have it your way, widow," he spat. "But when the Chiricahua come knocking, don't come crying to the U.S. Cavalry. $50 is the official bounty. But I've heard whispers. Some folks would pay a lot more to get their hands on Cochise's heir. A lot more." He gave her one last chilling look. "And I aim to collect." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his men following close behind, leaving Sarah standing in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. She slammed the door shut, the sound echoing the violent turmoil in her chest. She leaned against it, her body trembling. After a long moment, she heard a soft rustling sound. Noden crawled out from under the bed, his eyes wide with a fear that was now mingled with something else, a dawning comprehension. He may not have understood all the words, but he had understood the tone, the threat, the danger. He had understood that she had protected him. He stood before her, a small, silent figure in the center of the room. He looked at her, at the door, and then back at her. And then, for the first time since she had found him, he spoke. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it filled the silence of the cabin like a thunderclap. "Tassa," he said, and pointed to himself. Sarah stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. Tassa. It was the name he had cried out in his fevered dreams. His name. He then took a hesitant step towards her. He reached out a small, tentative hand and touched her arm. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking trust, a bridge across the chasm of fear and hatred that had separated their two peoples for generations. He pointed to the small, bluish tattoo on his wrist, the broken arrow in the circle, and whispered a single Apache word, a word that sounded like a prayer. Indachada. In that single, simple touch, everything changed. He was no longer just an Apache boy she had rescued. He was Taza. And she was no longer just a lonely widow hiding from the world. She was his protector, and she would protect him from the likes of Sergeant Corrigan, from the bounty hunters, from the entire world if she had to, whatever the cost. She just had to figure out what that strange word and the symbol on his wrist truly meant. The boy's name was Taza. The revelation of it, a single whispered word, had shattered the silence that had defined their strange, fragile coexistence. It was a beginning, a seed of trust planted in the barren soil of their shared isolation. In the days that followed, Taza remained a child of few words, but the oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a tentative, emerging connection. He began to follow her as she did her chores, a small, silent shadow, his dark eyes observing her every move with an unnerving intelligence. He watched her knead bread, mend a fence post, clean her rifle. He learned her rhythms, the quiet cadence of her solitary life. One afternoon, he pointed to the Winchester leaning against the wall. "Ijo," he said, his voice soft. Sarah, startled, realized it was the Apache word for the rifle. He then pointed to the skillet on the stove. "Tsa!" A plate. He was teaching her, bridging the gap between their worlds, one word at a time. Sarah, in turn, pointed to the object and repeated the English word. Rifle. Plate. Became a game between them, a quiet exchange of language and knowledge that filled the long, hot afternoons. She learned that Tassa was a keen observer of the natural world. He showed her which roots were edible, which berries were sweet, and which were poisonous. He could read the tracks of animals in the dust, telling her not just the creature that had passed, but how long ago and whether it was in a hurry. He was a child of the wilderness, and his knowledge was a currency far more valuable than the $50 bounty on his head. Her fear for him was a constant, gnawing presence. She scanned the horizon a dozen times a day, her heart lurching at the sight of a dust cloud or a distant rider. She knew Corrigan would not forget her defiance. He was a man who nursed a grudge. One evening, about a week after Corrigan's visit, Jedediah Stone arrived. His 2 mules, laden with beaver and fox pelts, looked as weary as the old trapper himself. Jedediah was a man carved from the very rock and wood of the frontier, his face a leathery mask of wrinkles, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of the winter sky. He had been a friend of John's, and his visits were a welcome anchor to a world she had almost forgotten. She saw him coming from a long way off, and her first instinct was to hide Taza, but she quickly dismissed the thought. Jedediah was not like the others. He had lived among the tribes in his youth, spoke a smattering of several native languages, and held a grudging respect for the Apache that was rare among the white men of the territory. If she couldn't trust Jedediah, she couldn't trust anyone. She met him outside, a mug of coffee already in her hand. "Jedediah," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "Sarah," he grunted, swinging his long legs off his horse. He took the mug and drank deeply. His gaze drifted to the cabin door, where Taza stood, half hidden, peering out at the strange mountain of a man. Jedediah's eyes, so often filled with a weary amusement, sharpened with a sudden, intense focus. He didn't seem surprised, but a deep, somber gravity settled over his features. "Looks like you've got company," he said, his voice low. "His name is Taza," Sarah said simply. "I found him. The wolves had him cornered." Jedediah nodded slowly, his eyes still on the boy. "Chiricahua," he said. It wasn't a question. He walked slowly towards the cabin, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He stopped a few feet from Taza and knelt down, a difficult, creaking process for his old bones. "Ya-ah-tae," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. It was an Apache greeting. Taza's eyes widened. He stared at the old trapper for a long moment, then gave a hesitant, almost imperceptible nod in return. That evening, as Taza slept on his blanket by the fire, Sarah told Jedediah everything. The wolves, the fever, Sergeant Corrigan, and his chilling visit. The fact that the boy was Cochise's son. She told him about the strange tattoo on Taza's wrist and the word he had spoken. Indashada. Jedediah listened patiently, his gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, his face grim. "You've stepped in it deep, Sarah," he said finally, his voice heavy. "Deeper than you know." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The tattoo on his wrist. The broken arrow. That's a sacred symbol. It means the bearer walks in peace. And that word he said, Inda Seda, it means peace treaty, or truce. Sarah, that boy wasn't just wandering. He was with his father on the way to a secret council. Sarah stared at him, her blood turning to ice. A council? With who? With Colonel Evans, the commander at the fort, Jedediah explained. Evans is a good man, an honorable man. He and Cochise have been sending messages back and forth for months, trying to hammer out a lasting peace. This meeting was supposed to be the final step, a secret meeting to end the war for good. Her mind raced, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Corrigan, she whispered. He knew about the meeting. He must have, Jedediah said grimly. And he's trying to sabotage it. Think about it. If he captures Cochise's son, or worse, if the boy ends up dead, the peace talks are finished. The war starts again, bloodier than ever. Corrigan gets his revenge, and no one is the wiser. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a new urgency. He's not just a greedy bully, Sarah. He's trying to set this whole territory on fire. He told you he was after a bounty, but he was lying. He's trying to start a war, and he's using you and this boy as the flint and steel. Sarah looked at the sleeping boy, at the rise and fall of his small chest, and felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was at the epicenter of a conflict that could set the entire territory ablaze. What do I do, Jedediah? She asked, her voice trembling. The old trapper looked at her, his pale eyes filled with a sad wisdom. Cochise will be tearing these plains apart looking for his son. He won't rest. Your only hope is that his people find you before Corrigan's patrol doubles back. He paused, his gaze thoughtful. They won't come in war, not if they know the boy is safe. Cochise is a man of honor, but Corrigan might have already poisoned that well. He might have already told them some lie. They'll see a white woman and they'll think I've stolen him, Sarah said desperately. They'll kill me. Maybe, Jedediah admitted. Or maybe they'll see what I see. A woman who saved a child's life. He stood up, his joints popping. I've got to be moving on at dawn, but you listen to me, Sarah. You keep that boy safe. You watch the horizon, and you pray that it's the Apache who find you first. Jedediah left the next morning, leaving Sarah with a new, heavier burden of fear and a sliver of desperate hope. The knowledge of the Peace Council changed everything. Taza was no longer just a boy. He was a prince, a symbol, the key to war or peace. 2 nights later, the prayer Jedediah had spoken of was answered. Sarah was woken from a light, restless sleep, not by a sound, but by a change in the atmosphere, a sudden prickling awareness that she was no longer alone. The air in the cabin felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. She reached for the Winchester, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Taza was already awake, sitting up on his blanket, his eyes fixed on the door. He was not afraid. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, she could see that his expression was one of solemn, reverent expectation. And then she saw them. Through the small window, she could see figures moving in the darkness, silent, shadowy forms that seemed to rise from the earth itself. They were on foot, their movements fluid and ghostly. They were surrounding her cabin. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. The Chiricahua had come. They had come for the son of their chief. She clutched the Winchester, her knuckles white, her mind a chaotic jumble of fear and resignation. She had done her best to protect him, but now it was over. She could not fight an entire war party. She could only pray that they would be merciful. She waited for the war cries, for the splintering of the door, for the hail of arrows and bullets. But there was only silence. A deep, profound silence that was more unnerving than any sound. Taza rose to his feet. He walked to the door, his small form silhouetted against the faint moonlight. He looked back at her, his dark eyes conveying a message she could not decipher. Then he unbarred the door and opened it. On the threshold stood a warrior. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of stern, impassive dignity. He wore a simple breechcloth and moccasins, his chest bare, his long black hair held back by a leather band. In his hand, he held not a rifle or a lance, but a single eagle feather. Behind him, in the moonlight, Sarah could see dozens of other warriors, all standing in a silent semicircle around her cabin. They were not painted for war, Their faces were solemn, their hands empty. Taza stepped forward and spoke a single word. Shataya, he said. Father. The tall warrior's impassive mask crumbled, his eyes, so like his son's, filled with a profound, overwhelming relief. He knelt and enveloped the boy in his arms, holding him tightly, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion. This was Cochise, the great war chief, the terror of the territory, was on his knees at her doorstep, weeping with joy at the return of his son. Sarah stood frozen, the Winchester still clutched in her hands, a silent, stunned witness. After a long moment, Cochise released his son and rose to his full, imposing height. His eyes, still glistening with unshed tears, found hers. He looked at her, at the rifle in her hands, at the simple, clean cabin behind her. His gaze was searching, intense, as if he were trying to read her very soul. He said something in his own language, his voice a low, powerful rumble. Taza, still standing by his father's side, translated for the first time in a full sentence. My father asks why you have not claimed the bounty for his son. Sarah stared at him, bewildered. The bounty? The white soldier. Corrigan, Taza explained, his small face serious. He came to my father's camp. He said he knew where I was. He carried a piece of my moccasin that was torn at the rocks. He said a white woman had me, and she would give me back, for a crate of new rifles. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with a sickening thud. Corrigan. He hadn't just threatened her. He had gone to the Apache. He had tried to play both sides against each other, to frame her as a kidnapper and an arms dealer, to push Cochise into an act of aggression that would shatter the peace talks and give him the war he so desperately craved. That's a lie, Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. I never asked for any money. I saved him from the wolves. I was protecting him. Cochise listened to his son's translation, his expression unreadable. He then took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He was so close now that she could see the lines of grief and worry etched around his eyes, the gray streaks in his black hair. He was not the monster of her imagination. He was a man, a father who had feared for the life of his child. He spoke again, his voice softer this time. Taza translated, My father says he knows this. He says a man who lies for guns has a shifty heart. He says he followed the tracks from the rocks. He saw the tracks of the wolves. He saw your small tracks leading away. He saw that you carried me when I could not walk. He says he came not to fight, but to see the woman who would save the son of her enemy. He gestured to the warriors behind him. He says he has brought gifts. They began to move forward, one by one, their movements silent and graceful. They came to her doorstep and laid their offerings on the ground. There were beautifully tanned deer hides, so soft they looked like velvet. There were intricately woven baskets filled with dried corn and mesquite beans. There was a magnificent blanket woven with the colors of the sunset. And finally, one warrior laid down a rifle, a brand new Spencer repeating carbine, far superior to her old Winchester. Sarah stared at the pile of gifts, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. This was not the retribution she had feared. This was gratitude, an offering of peace, of respect, from the very people she had been taught to hate. Cochise spoke a final time. My father says you have shown great honor, Taza said, his voice filled with pride. He says the Chiricahua will not forget this. This land you live on, it is your land now. No Apache will ever harm you or your home. You are one of us. You are Shima Yaji. What does that mean? Sarah whispered. Taza smiled, a rare, beautiful sight. It means little mother. As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the Apache warriors prepared to leave. Cochise was the last to go. He stood for a moment, his hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze meeting Sarah's over the pile of gifts. He gave a single solemn nod, a gesture of profound, unspoken understanding. But just as he turned to leave, a flare of light shot into the sky from the direction of the distant fort. Cochise paused, a grim smile touching his lips. He spoke to Taza, who looked at Sarah with wide eyes. My father says the old trapper, your friend, is a man who rides like the wind. He did not just ride on, He rode to the fort. He told the colonel, the soldier leader Evans, of the sergeant's lies and his plan to start a war. Another flare went up, this one green. "That is the signal," Taza said, his voice full of awe. "The signal of peace. It means the treaty will be signed. It means the lying soldier has been stopped." And as the Apache melted back into the wilderness, Sarah saw a small dust cloud moving away from the fort. It was a patrol. In the center, she could just make out a figure on a horse, his hands bound. Sergeant Corrigan. Justice, swift and silent, delivered on the plains. Sarah was left alone in the quiet of the morning, the pile of gifts at her feet, a testament to the incredible events of the night. She looked at her small, humble cabin, at the vast plains stretching out before her. It was the same land, the same sky, the same silence. But everything had changed. The hatred that had been her constant companion for 3 long years had been washed away, replaced by something new, something that felt like hope. She had pulled a crying Apache boy from a wolf pack, and in return his tribe had pulled her from the wilderness of her own grief and given her a new name, a new identity, a new place in the world. She was no longer just a widow. She was Shima Yaji, and for the first time in a long, long time, she was not alone. In the heart of a land defined by violence and mistrust, a single act of compassion rewrote the rules of survival. Sarah McGregor, a woman entombed by her own sorrow, chose not to see an enemy, but a child in peril. In saving Taza, she not only rescued a boy, but also found her own salvation, bridging a chasm of hatred with a bridge of shared humanity. Her story is a powerful reminder that our deepest connections are often forged in the most unexpected of circumstances, and that the courage to defy the hatred of our world can lead to a peace we never thought possible. If this story of bravery, loss, and redemption moved you, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories from the forgotten corners of history, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Sarah's incredible choice. Thanks for watching.